All right, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are, whether you're watching this live or joining us on a rebroadcast via YouTube. I am Dr. Jim Gumbo Coughlin. It is my privilege to welcome you to Lagniappe Leadership Discussion. Lagniappe means a little something extra, and that's what this leadership discussion is focused on, is bringing a little bit something extra to the topic of leadership, which there's many books, many leather-bound books that talk about leadership, and so we hope to contribute to that. This is number 4, and so we're privileged for number 4 to bring with us John Visneski, who is no stranger to leadership. He served our nation for about a decade as a cyberspace operations officer, and then transitioned to the commercial space where he leads as a cyber information security officer for multiple organizations. Right now it's MGM Studios. And so I want to start our session off by going the views and opinions given during this discussion are do not represent the Department of Defense, nor MGM Studios, nor his dog. And so these are our opinions, they're our own, where we're going to riff on leadership for about an hour and take it there. So as I stated, John served our nation for a while, has a couple deployments both to Iraq and Afghanistan, worked NATO rule of law in Afghanistan, worked on the air staff where he finished his term in service, literally working right outside the Chief of Staff of the Air Force's office. And so like literally right around the corner from the chief, he had to walk by John's office to get to his own office. That's the power John had at the time. And John left the Air Force, went into industry, and has been a cyber security advisor and officer for multiple companies, to include the Pokemon Company, which is one I always tell the story about because that's cool. Accolade, and now MGM Studios. He's also on the speaking circuit, so probably has an office around him with many books. And today he's doing the Zoom Flex with a powerful plant behind him. So that's a first for us. Last time we had Nerf guns. So because our last leadership member runs a Dart Wars, and so it's a Nerf gun place in Colorado Springs. So John, I kind of breezed through your bio real quickly, and I'll put a link to it. But tell us something about you that's not in the bio that I highlighted.
One, thank you for the introduction. At least 50% of it, I was good at, and maybe the other half, I tried my best. The other thing, thank you for the disclaimer up the top that this is our own opinions and things like that. I was going to mention that as well. And then thank you about the plant. My wife is a lovely decorator, and during the pandemic, I think we all started realizing that it's valuable to have a good background, whether it's a virtual background or something else. Other than what Gumbo already said in terms of my professional background, I hail from Seattle, Washington originally. I live down in Los Angeles, California now on account of the MGM Studios job. Love the outdoors, love hiking, love running. My wife and I love to travel. And I think one of the things that I'm super excited to be here about, and particularly because Gumbo invited me, is that regardless of whether or not I stayed in the Air Force for a particularly long time, I consider one of my passions trying to do as much as I can to stay connected with the services, and stay connected with old friends, and stay connected with folks that are up and coming through, particularly the cyberspace operations officer ranks and whatever else we want to call some of those AFSCs now, because I think that moving forward, the strength of the nation is going to be our ability to build bridges between public and private institutions, and share knowledge, and share what it's like to be on either side of the fence, because I think that's what's going to make us strong as a holistic cyberspace community. So thanks for having me, Gumbo.
Yeah, thanks, John. I appreciate the added piece, and I know you're enjoying the weather in LA. It's always beautiful when we go out there to visit friends and family. It's just a beautiful area of our nation. And as a sports fan, there's some really good sports teams in the area too. And so there's no shortage of things. And then of course, as a runner, there's great places to run out there and experience. And as you know, I take pictures when I go running, so I love my runs in that area. So, first question I have for you is, you and I used to cross paths in the hallway of the Pentagon, and you hit on it a little bit, but it's the personal network piece, right? from our two different roles, which are two disparate things at the time, we were able to get some crazy behind the door scenes kind of handled sideways. And so can you speak to the value of personal networks on outside of the military and how that helps facilitate leadership in multiple organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, I think far too often people confuse personal networking with your ability to practice nepotism, or your ability to have a good old boys club or a good old girls club or whatever you want to say. But in reality, what it ends up being is finding a network of shared and diverse ideas, regardless of if it's someone that I want to have a beer with necessarily. Having an understanding of how professionals are flowing through different jobs, different industries, whether they're on a sales side, whether they're on a business to business, side, or whether they're business to consumer. Having an understanding of where people are coming from, and really, putting yourself in their shoes makes you a more powerful leader. The thing I like to say, particularly when it comes to the private sector and working in a company that is buying, SaaS services, let's say, the vendor, the vendor customer relationship has fundamentally changed in the last 15 or so years when it comes to cybersecurity specifically. It used to be that a customer could reach out to a vendor and say, hey, give me all of your features at half the price and twice as fast as your engineers can actually implement it. And that has fundamentally changed. Organizationally, there's a vested interest in seeing vested interest in seeing both people on that side of the equation be successful. The old adage about rising tide lifts all ships. And that doesn't start like at a company level. That starts at a person to person peer networking level. And so as you continue to build your network on the outside of the military, or even within the military, your ability to reach out to friends or colleagues or folks that you've met along the way and have an understanding of their journey to get wherever they were is a very powerful thing. I worked in healthcare for a while, and I worked in the gaming industry before that. So I have people still reaching out to me to ask me questions about, like, hey, I'm either trying to break into this particular industry, or I'm a salesperson trying to sell to a game company, or I'm about to join a healthcare company. I want to have an understanding of healthcare regulations and audits and all those sorts of things. And because I've gone on that journey, and because people know I've gone on that journey, I can be a resource. And I tell you what, I reach out to people like that all the time when it comes to answering questions and when it comes to making myself smarter, because you're only as powerful as that network when you're on the outside of the military.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I like to read books a little bit, and one of the books that I really like that articulates the intricacies of networking is Dr. Neil Ferguson's book, The Tower in the Square, right? So
Sure.
he's a colleague of mine from my time at the Hoover Institution, brilliant historian. Actually, while writing volume 1 of the biography for Dr. Kissinger, he determined that really what made Henry Kissinger so great at his roles it's not his position, it was his ability to connect people, is his network. And in his research, he has a tremendous research team that facilitates his writing. And his research discerned that if you went throughout history, what you found is you have these great networks of people that could get great and tremendous things accomplished. And the only way to destroy that was hierarchy, right? And so hence his tower in the square, right? And so when you articulate a square, there's this great people flow and population flow. Imagine a market, and imagine the connective tissue of buyer from one form of the market sells to another, and things travel that way. But the thing that knocks that down is the tower, right? That knocks that over. And so you kind of hit on that perspective on that is, how do you grow that network along the way? Sorry. How do you grow that network as you go on and make it diverse? You hit on the diversity part, which I think sometimes gets missed in the diversity conversation, is that sometimes it's not just about the physical diversity. It's really about the experiential diversity that gives you the best thing. I think too often we get in these environments where everybody in the room not only maybe looks the same, but they all have the same background. And
Right.
you're going to look at the same story. So we got our first question comes from Rachel Reynolds, who is a PhD candidate. I like to throw that out there because she's getting pretty close to being done. And her question is, how does profit motivation in the commercial sector change the way folks view the cybersecurity mission? This kind of goes to your statement earlier, versus national security motivation in the military. So how did you make that transition? And then how do you experience that today?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I will start with a very broad statement that the resourcing challenges for cybersecurity in the private sector are very similar to the resourcing challenges in the public sector and in the Department of Defense. I get the question a lot in terms of like, what was it like moving from the DoD to Pokemon, and what I liken that to essentially is resistance training. You've seen like videos of Olympic sprinters that have like the band that's sort of helping them, give them some resistance so that when you take the band off, they run faster. In a lot of cases, leaving the military and going into the private sector feels a lot like that in terms of you have a bit more cash to deal with, and things move a little bit faster, even in the environments where you might be a little bit more resource constrained. Now, the interesting thing when it comes to the profit piece of that is that the hardest thing to quantify in the private sector when it comes to cybersecurity is how are you being a business enabler and not just a rainy day fund that you might not ever need to use, right? Like how do you justify spending $1 million one year and nothing happens, and then you go to the board and say, hey, I needed $1 million more bucks, and they said, well, nothing happened with this first $1 million, so why should we give you another one? And so that is like the tale as old as time when it comes to cybersecurity in the private sector. And I think what you're seeing is a shift that cybersecurity professionals are not saying less technical, but their focus is more on relationship building. Their focus is more on tying themselves into the actual business objectives so that when they're making, and when they're advocating for resources, people, technology, new processes, expanded responsibilities, tying those things specifically to things that a profit-based company is going to be concerned with, stock prices, profit margins, profit and loss. What are we actually delivering to our customers? And if you can start talking in those terms when it comes to the board and when it comes to your fellow executives, you end up being able to elevate some of those key cybersecurity items that you're talking about, because it's less about, hey, nerd, it's going to make you safe, and more about we're reducing overall risk to the enterprise. And in some cases, because these days it's all about automation, it's all about visibility, it's all about how do we do things faster. A lot of those same principles that we're starting to leverage and starting to see in the cybersecurity industry are the exact same things that your technologists on the other side of the table, your CTOs, your CIOs, it's the exact same things that are going to make them be successful. Case in point, we're using this company, not to make a Wiz commercial, but we're using this company called Wiz.io to give us visibility into our cloud infrastructure. And one of the cool things about Wiz.io is that it provides you like all sorts of context around the prioritization of risks within your cloud infrastructure. Because classically, what would happen is that a security team would go to your CTO and say, hey, we found all these vulnerabilities in your infrastructure, go fix them. And we're going to try to bin these in terms of criticality, and then we're going to have SLAs based on that criticality. And really the CTO looks back at you and says, well, I don't have a million monkeys on a million typewriters to write Shakespeare. And oh, by the way, the same people that should be fixing this are the exact same people that are developing new features to push the business forward to generate revenue. So would you like to tell the CEO that the reason that we're not, developing new tools to push the business forward and generate revenue, that's not going to happen this quarter because we're busy fixing these vulnerabilities? And so more and more you're seeing companies like Wiz pivot to a model where providing that context and giving people a shared language in terms of how they do risk management, specifically when it comes to things like patch management and security tooling. What it ends up doing is prioritizing that work in such a way that you can really start to winnow down on false positives, winnow down on things that really aren't presenting a risk to the enterprise, which makes your engineers very happy. And then once you have that shared language, what it does is over time organically teach those engineers better practices in terms of secure coding, in terms of secure development. And that cuts out a middleman, which makes their lives easier, which makes them able to concentrate on the things that are actually going to generate the company revenue. And so I think that sort of mentality is starting to shift in the private sector a little bit faster than perhaps in the Department of Defense. If no offense to my DISA brothers and sisters out there, but like, those are the sorts of things that people are going to have to start latching onto, is that, security folks should be helping people, make their jobs easier and faster, not just necessarily more secure. One of the things I like to tell my team all the time is you're problem solvers first and security practitioners second. And if you look at the world that way, especially in the private sector, it goes a long way towards earning the trust of the business in like a profit sort of a profit focused organization. Did I answer your question?
Yeah,
Oh.
she'll chat in if it didn't. I mean, you hit a lot
That
of
was great.
really good points in there. I wrote down some things I'll have to take back to my own CISO and ISOs and stuff in my current role. But I think one of the questions I have for you, you hit on a couple of the other entities within the C-suite, right? And there's books out there that articulate, a CISO's lifespan's about 12 to 18 months at a company.
Yeah.
You're only as good as the last time you were secure. The first time you're owned is the last day of employment. All these types of articulations. And one of the interesting things in one of the books on cybersecurity, the doctor's name escapes me right now, but he articulates that where the CISO sits in terms of the C-suite architecture determines really what the focus is. So if the CISO is under the CFO, then your risk is financially informed. If the CISO is under the CTO, then it's technology informed. If the CISO is a direct report to the COO or to the CEO, then you're more like on par with your colleagues to where you can have that better articulated risk discussion. So you've served in this role in 3 different companies, I think, at this time. So has your position been in different levels in the C-suite? Has it been comparable? And if it, how has that been across the organizations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And 2, it's really well timed because of the Joe Sullivan Uber case. And we can table that discussion and maybe hit on it a little bit later. But I think there's sort of it's been going on for a while in terms of the cultural changes of where the CISO sits and who they report to. And I think that conversation is becoming more and more important in terms of personal liability when it comes to what the CISO's role is within an organization, particularly within a publicly traded organization. To answer your question about me specifically, I've done it all at this point, with the exception of reporting directly to the CEO or directly to the board from an administrative standpoint. My first gig, I reported to essentially what was the CTO. Second gig, I reported to actually the general counsel, the chief legal officer. And then my third gig, MGM Studios reported to the CFO. Now, we just got acquired by Amazon. Another caveat there. None of my opinions are that of Amazon. Thank you, Amazon. But so I've sort of experienced a number of different flavors. What I will say is that I tend to lean towards reporting directly to the CEO, and if it's the case where it's a publicly traded company, reporting directly to the board or whoever the chairman of the board is, which in a lot of cases is the CEO, and that's for a number of different reasons. To your point, typically when you work for the CFO, like the way that you're going to be able to get your messages across is with a financially based risk analysis. When you're working for the general counsel, a lot of it is going to be a little bit more broad in terms of risk, but a lot of legal risk, which obviously ties very closely to the financial risk. And then working for the CTO, personally, the CTO or the CIO, although I really enjoyed working for those humans that I worked for, I think is the most problematic. Because what ends up happening is that there's a natural friction that is always existing between your pure technologist, IT, CTO, CIO, and your CISO. Because for unless you have really good RACI matrices and a really good relationship and an ability to close the door and like really tell it how it is, you have a hard time when it comes to deciding how resources are spent. And you have a hard time really telling it how it is if you really do need to say, hey, there was a breach and this is why, and this is who's responsible, and so on and so forth. That becomes very hard when your reporting structure is through the person that's sort of in charge of all the technology. I tend to think that in those cases, making sure that you have a really, well, in any case, making sure that you like lean into NIST and get your responsibility matrix, your RACI matrix together in terms of who's actually responsible, who's accountable, who's actually doing the work, and who's informed by that work, I think becomes essential in those particular cases. I don't have the market research in front of me. I'll pass it along to you when I do have it, but you're starting to see the pendulum swing towards more CISOs reporting directly to the CEO or someone, or a COO, or someone in that particular particular neck of the woods.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to watch the pendulum swing, and as you articulated early, there might be some organizations that are a little bit behind the time in that transition. I think organizational culture plays a role here, right? And so, we talk about risk and where you stand is where you sit, all those other platitudes that are articulated out there. So how do you've had this conversation 3 times now, I guess 4 with the acquisition, but let's just say for giggles 3 times. So you have 3 personal case studies. And in a sense, you really have 4 because, you kind of served a little bit of that role before you left the Air Force, not obviously at the C-suite level, but you're right there next to the chief, right? And so, if Chief 21 had a question on cybersecurity and you were there, you're the dude, right? Or whatever. And so, how have you been able to do that translation? You talked about that a little bit. You've got to be a problem solver first. And within your domain, within your roles and responsibilities, you have to be able to translate the risk, right? A breach, here's responsible. But really, because of where you sit now, there's a return on investment, right? You articulated to spend $1 million here. I need to spend another $1 million. Maybe the difference, it's not tangible.
Right.
Like as a communicator, the expectation is you're up 100% of the time, because as one of my colleagues said in a previous assignment, calm is like oxygen. You don't know how important it is till you don't have it. And then you physically can't function. Right. And so same thing for cybersecurity, is when you go to bed asleep at night, it's because the cybersecurity professionals or the automation did their job. And so how do you have that conversation with non-technologists, or how do you have that conversation with boards that articulates the risk and can have that convincing standpoint that they need to invest more to protect their intellectual property?
Yeah, I mean, I think I will sound like I'm being roundabout, but I think I can hit everything in one circle. First, I'll start with one interesting data point is that at Amazon, the CSO, Steve Schmidt, he reports directly to Andy Jassy. And so that's how Amazon does it. And I like to think that they're pretty good at technology. Now, one of the challenges that we've had, and I think one of the reasons that there's such not an argument about where the CISO should sit, but sort of not finding the right fit, is that I think historically we've been very bad at exactly what you said, is translating things. We come into the room like Chicken Little. The world is going to catch on fire and going to fall on us if we don't roll out, a new endpoint detection and response suite to our infrastructure. The world's going to fall apart if we don't have the right DR in place. The world's going to fall apart if we do this and we do that. And a lot of times it's speaking in ones and zeros and not speaking in something that translates it to a fighter pilot, which is exactly what, when I worked at the Pentagon, that was exactly the challenge that we were fighting with, whether I was in, with the A6 crew or whether I was working, next to the chief. Being able to explain why something is important without resorting to, the fear, the FUD sort of aspects of it ends up being, a crucial part of your job, which then enters us into one of the other philosophical, not arguments, but philosophical discussions happening in the private sector specifically is, are companies looking for a quote unquote technical CISO, or are they looking for a quote unquote business CISO? Are they looking for someone that's going to be able to dive deep into the weeds, comb through logs, write scripts, all those sorts of things? Or are they looking for someone that can walk into the boardroom, own that space, tell a story, craft a narrative as to why security is important to the organization and how it's going to help the organization grow and become better? I think those two sorts of ends of the spectrum are exactly what we're talking about. And there's actually a joke, within the CISO community that when a new job posting comes out, we'll, ping on the side on Slack and say, hey, are they looking for a unicorn? And what we mean by that is a lot of times they're looking for someone that can speak to the board with confidence and can craft the narrative. But oh, by the way, also happen to be like a cyber ninja hacker in their spare time and all those sorts of things. And it's called a unicorn because there's only, I can count on my hand of all the CISOs I know, I can count maybe like 10 of those folks. And don't get me wrong, they're some of the smartest people I've ever met, but like basing your entire strategy on that is super difficult. Now, I like to consider myself pretty good on a keyboard, like if I dedicate the time to do it, but quite frankly, I haven't had the time to do it because I like a lot of cyber officers in the Air Force started out as a combat comm officer, and quite frankly, they wouldn't let me touch a keyboard even if I asked to, other than to answer emails. But what I did learn during that experience was how to tell a story, was how to take care of people, was how to recognize the talent in other folks that I could surround myself with in order for us to achieve an objective. So I think when it comes to that sort of conversation about the spectrum, and it ties into where the CISO should sit, because quite frankly, a lot of times the CISO isn't reporting to the CEO, not because cybersecurity isn't important to the organization, but because they don't have someone in that role that can speak coherently about the entire story. And so they in a lot of cases will actually just have them report to the CFO or the chief legal officer or the CIO as a buffer layer, so that crazy kook doesn't get into the room and say something that is gonna scare everyone. And so I think that's what we need to reckon with as an industry, security wise, regardless of if it's in the private sector or the public sector, and start having people understand that like your ability to communicate and your ability to recognize talent, regardless of your own technical aptitude, understanding all the tech stack and security principles and things is super important. But those soft skills are what makes a lot of successful CISOs these days.
Yeah, I think
I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And obviously I went on a roundabout getting to it. And I did want to correct, I looked up the book. So Dr. Mansour Hasib, he writes this book on cybersecurity leadership is what it's called. And he's the one that articulates the where you sit, which is to your piece. And he didn't really break it down on the technology vice business CISO side. I really like that perspective. I will tell you, I like to use the phrase 7 successive miracles, right? Because I'll get people all the time that go, well, this is the worst parts of the Bible. Like if we don't secure this, sure, basically the whole enterprise is going to fail. And I'll literally go, okay, so copy that. But what does it take to actually accomplish what you want to do? And do we already have other things in place that minimize that risk, right? And so, right, yes, somebody has to be able to get near the enterprise with this capability and the right rights to do all that at the same time, presupposing nobody does phishing or whatever. You know right, what I mean? And they're like, well, yeah, it would require all that. I'm like, okay, so I actually have other mitigation steps in place. I don't need to spend money on that. And exactly, I can quantify that risk, right? And I can go, hey, yeah, worst part. So no, by the way, if that happens, that's like a bigger problem because that's like an insider threat thing. And, that's other issues. And so you talked about, the difference between a technologist and a business savvy person. You articulated unicorn, which is interesting because you're just south of a Silicon Valley. And of course, a unicorn there is a company that at IPO is going to get a $1 billion valuation, right? And, if you don't have very good cybersecurity practices, there goes your valuation, right? As you articulated, there's some stuff in the news right now on some challenges on the cybersecurity side. So when you're interfacing with your peers and you guys are discussing some of your biggest challenges outside of, adversary X trying to get after IP, what are the top 2 or 3 things that you amongst your peers actually discuss within your community?
I think one of the big ones is talent management writ large, which shouldn't surprise anyone on either side, the public sector or the private sector. And I think we throw around talent gap a whole lot and those sorts of things. I think the challenge isn't a talent shortage. I think in a lot of cases the talent shortage is because we don't always look in the right places and we're not recruiting the right sort of mindsets, right? Like one of the best security engineers I ever met started out as just like a sysadmin and then like started tinkering around with AWS tools and started understanding how systems of systems fit together. And people that understand how systems of systems fit together understand that there's gaps and seams in those systems, and are usually really good at finding those gaps and seams and having that exact conversation that you were just talking about in terms of, do we have mitigations in place, and what's the overall risk of this vulnerability and things like that. Because that landscape changes so much that having people on your team that can understand that in real time and aren't so laser focused on whatever their specific task is super important. And so I think we have those discussions probably more than anything is how do we find those people? How do we develop people that might not have been grown in a lab as a CEH certified or OCP certified hacker? Like, how do we actually find people that we can bring into the security field that, quite frankly, might be better at it than the people that we teach out of the lab, because they have some practical experience actually working with systems. And I think that's one of the big things that we talk about. Another thing we talk about, quite a bit, is the changing nature of security integrations at scale. And what I mean by that is that, like, there's a million vendors and a million different tools, and every time there's a breach or every time there's a big incident in the news, you can almost hear like 17 startups in San Francisco that are going to solve that problem specifically for you. And navigating that space takes a lot. And it is taxing. I have a peer, and I have no doubt this is true, that gets 200 messages a day on LinkedIn from various security vendors. Obviously a lot of repeats in there, and obviously some really bad, CRMs in there that you just get like the same canned email over and over again. But that sort of like flood of information and trying to wade through technology is super hard to deal with. The blessing and the curse of working in the private sector in terms of having a little bit more access to, not necessarily more money than the Department of Defense, that's pretty hard to do, but having the access of like faster acquisitions, faster implementation in a lot of cases. The flip side of that is that there's a tendency for some organizations, if they are giving their technology and security organizations a lot of funding, is for sort of overload of those tools. And so how do you make sure that you have the right amount of security tooling in place, as opposed to, hey, this looks neat, let's see if we can try it for a year, and then it turns out, once you get it out of the box, it doesn't actually work. So that's another thing that we talk about quite a bit, is just sort of, how do all these tools fit together? How are they building towards your overall security strategy? And then I think the third thing that we talk about quite a bit when it comes to vendors specifically is the profile of a security vendor. Are they someone that was just sort of an ambulance chaser, and they're building a startup that maybe has a really good idea and some cool technology in the middle of it, but in reality, they're just trying to get bought by one of the bigger organizations? Is it a company that really is passionate about it and has some secret sauce, and they're really driving towards an IPO? Is it a company that after the third round of funding, they're going to spend all that funding on sales folks instead of engineers, so that when you actually do call them on the phone and say, hey, there's a feature that's busted, I'd like to put in a ticket, they're like, okay, get in line, because we only have 2 engineers, but we now have 175 sales folks that are then emailing my buddy, 200 times a day. So that's the other thing that we sort of get into is the ecosystem itself is as complex as the threats that we face. And so I think there's a lot of conversation about how do you pick through those things in a way that's a little bit easier to manage. No offense to the Gartners of the world, but a 4-quad chart doesn't tell me how that tool is going to interface with my identity management tool, is going to interface with my EDR, is going to interface with my firewall, is going to interface with my SIM, is going to interface with my team. Do I have the team that knows how to use this? So on and so forth.
Yeah, those are great. And I want to tease a couple of them out. So the first one is talent. You articulated, so there was a report last year that said we're about 2.2 million cyber and IT professionals short globally, and 377,000 short in the US, which, for you and me, that's like 1 United States Air Force plus 2/3 Marine Corps short of cyber and IT professionals in the US, right? And then you articulated there's some diamonds in the rough. With my amount of kids, I'm a Disney fan, and so I'll quote that. So there's some diamonds in the rough where maybe it's a person that she or he does X during the day, but at night, they're a cybersecurity professional. And so that is a big talent challenge for us. I think one of the issues we have, as I say in my current role, my number one concern is the ability to gain, retain, train, sustain, and transition talent. because everybody's competing for these same exquisite people. And then the added variable, and I'd like to hear your piece on this, is what is now referred to as the future of work, right? And so the pandemic sped up the idea of remote work, right?
Mhm.
A lot of companies would say, yeah, we're going to do that in the 2040, right? And then the pandemic hit and they're like, oh, we're going to do that today.
Right.
And, we're going to force this infrastructure, and now we're going to send humans home, and we're going to give them keys to the kingdom, but from their house, which means they're going through their own systems to get to our kingdom. And so how have you as a cybersecurity professionals dealt with that talent transition that is looking at the future of work, but in enabling that, you're actually you might be introducing more risk into your enterprise?
Sure. So a couple of thoughts. And I'll try not to say zero trust too much, because I think that phrase gets thrown around far too often, and I think most organizations are pretty close to it anyway with MFA and SaaS applications and things like that. I think the ace we have up our sleeve, we like to talk a lot of trash about generations that come behind us, but the ace we have up our sleeves is that we're raising digital natives, and there's folks that are going to understand things a little bit better than my generation. I know, Gumbo, you're probably like 85 years old, so a little bit better than your generation. So I think the ace we have up our sleeve is that we have a lot of folks that are going to have an understanding of how things work, at least from a user interface, user experience. What I think we need to do as technologists and as folks that are in positions of relative influence, is really lean hard into what are we doing, whether it's volunteer work, whether it's donating to organizations, whether it's giving talks, whether it's encouraging our kids to dig a little bit deeper and take some of those STEM classes and start learning about how this stuff fits together. I think when it comes to the future of work specifically, I think that there was a number of organizations that were really ready for it because they were already sort of telework focused. I think the Amazons of the world, and when the pandemic hit, I was at Pokemon, and we were a telework enabled organization, and so transitioning wasn't a big deal for us. I think there's a lot of the soft stuff in terms of like the mental and emotional and spiritual and people person implications of us being at home all the time looking at computer screens instead of us being in the same room and like having a conversation around a water cooler, that I think are way more important than a lot of the risk that bringing folks home and then giving them the keys to the kingdom are. I think the cool thing that came out of all of this in terms of the remote work was a renewed urgency for things like multi-factor authentication, a renewed urgency for organizations that perhaps hadn't gone through their cliched digital transformation and start putting workloads into the cloud. I think that pushed a lot of organizations to sort of rethink not just their policies of work from home and not just benefit policies and where people live, but real technology discussions about how their infrastructure is set up. Not to mention how that interplays with leases, office spaces, all those sorts of things. I think really the two things to consider there are the education of the next generation of folks that are going to, inherit this, work from home type thing. And then from a technology standpoint, I see it as a boon for some of the things that I think we had a harder time getting people to understand before, but a little bit easier time now.
Yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate that insight. And, having raised digital natives, I'm not quite as old as you opined, but having raised, because you and I are actually very close in age, to be fair. But I'll leave that alone.
Yeah.
But, I concur with that. And I think the training is there. My sixth son, my youngest of our boys out of our 9, he started school when we lived in Silicon Valley, right? And so he went to the same elementary school that Steve Jobs went to, and they taught coding in kindergarten. And I will tell you, having moved from Silicon Valley to 3 successive states, none of them are teaching coding at all at any grade level. And so I think there are portions of our nation that understand that. And we definitely saw it there. I will tell you that boy was coding before he could read. because he could do object oriented. And today we punish him by taking away his ability to code.
Well, and I think what's interesting, sorry to interrupt, I think, it's less about growing software developers and security folks. Like your ability to code and your ability to understand how those things kind of work and fit together are going to help people in so many jobs, regardless of if it's pure technology. I mean, if you look at a UX designer or UI designer, or you look at, someone that's working in finance, or someone that's working in a whole bunch of different industries and a whole bunch of different verticals within specific industries, having that ability and having an understanding of systems design and having an understanding of those things at a young age is going to be huge. It's like I wish I had started golfing when I was in like 4th grade, because I'd be really freaking good at it by now. But unfortunately, I didn't start until I was like 30, and so I suck, right? And so I think that's the other aspect of it, is that like working your mind in that way, regardless of if someone wants to be a nerd when they grow up, I think it's just a super valuable skill set for folks to have. And I think there's some countries that are really leaning into that, and some countries that aren't.
Yeah, fair. All right, so let's go to another question. So Austin Meyer, who I had the privilege of working with in my last assignment, he asked the question, so I'm going to kind of parse it out. So he says, if you frame your mind on where are we at and where do we want to go, and then how do we get from there to there, understanding that you have resource challenges, you have talent challenges, you have technology, I would call it tech debt, you have old debt technology, you want to bring in new technology, and you're going to miss some opportunities in there. How do you align all those different variables at the same time while still focusing on information security, delivering secure actions at the time of need for your organizations?
Ooh, that's the
how
job,
Austin
man.
is, man. I spent a year, I spent a
That's
long
the
time
job.
next to him. He's
And
an
I
in-depth
apologize.
thinker.
I apologize for coughing. I'm fighting off a cold. So one, that's the $1 million question. And I think depending on the organization's willingness to do the hard work of risk analysis is the big key, right? So I like, pardon my French, but when you're served a big shit sandwich, the hardest thing is to figure out where to take the first bite. And when it comes to an organization where you are faced with tech debt, which I think a lot of folks don't even realize how much tech debt they probably have. When you're faced with perhaps low investment in some key areas in your security program, when you're faced with resource constraints around all of that, your ability to really get good at taking qualified risks and quantifying them is super important. And so security metrics are like the hardest thing in the world to manage. Like show me someone that's really good at security metrics, and I'll show you someone that's probably BSing you a little bit. Because the hardest thing in the world is to figure out, like, okay, I have a risk in my cloud infrastructure that we've rated as a high, and then I have another risk on some of my on-prem stuff or with some of my workstations that's rated as a high. And I know that it's going to cost me $1 million to fix this one by buying a tool or implementing a new process or hiring some people or whatever. And it's going to cost me $50,000 to fix this hole over here. The next question ends up being is like, how do you quantify the risk to each of those things? We say it's high. That's a really good quality. High. That sounds scary. But at the end of the day, like drilling deep, what does that mean? Okay, well, this one's high because, if that laptop gets breached, it has financial data for the last 15 years. Okay, great. How about this one? Well, if that one gets breached, it's going to allow lateral movement into the user database, and the user database has millions upon millions of PII records or what have you. And then you multiply that conversation, not linearly. That is an exponential conversation with all parts of your infrastructure and all risk that you can get. And so doubling and tripling down on educating yourself and educating your workforce on the importance of understanding risk management and how you turn qualified risks into something that's indexable and something that you can actually start having an agreement across your technology stack of where to eat that first bite ends up being super critical when it comes to resource planning year over year, understanding where you get started, and correcting some of the missed opportunities. Technical debt specifically is probably the hardest thing in the world to tackle. Because like I said, most organizations, they don't have they don't have a dedicated team that's like looking backwards at all the toys that are left on the the bedroom floor. They're looking forward at all the toys that they can buy and play with. And so, having that discussion as well in terms of how do you quantify the risk to an organization based on technical debt. So, Lambda functions within AWS are a really great example. Lambda, super powerful tool. If you don't know what it is, basically it's like, code layer, infrastructure, super fast, all those sorts of things. But one of the things that a lot of folks don't realize is that as you start building Lambda functions, you actually have to get rid of the old ones. And so a lot of the big security problems originally, as people were starting to use Lambda more and more, was that you'd have, 1 million functions in the course of 6 months. And then you start doing some analysis and you realize 25,000 of them aren't being used on a regular basis. We're never gotten rid of. And oh, by the way, have access to your EC2 instances and your S3 buckets and all sorts of things. And so like that attack vector ends up being something that is technical debt, but because there's no one actually looking in terms of that technical debt and then quantifying that risk to the overall infrastructure, it's really hard to get people off their butts to fix that sort of thing. And then magnify that across your entire security stack. And that's the challenge, right? And it all really comes down to your ability to actually quantify risk.
Yeah, that's excellent. I appreciate the way you broke that down. And I will tell you, I live a lot of that every day. So as I say, my top two priorities are talent debt and tech debt in my current role, and articulating that and finding that is key. I like to say I'm really tired of delivering yesterday's technology tomorrow. I want to get in the business of delivering tomorrow's technology today. But in order to do that, I've got to get rid of some of my debt and I've got to upskill my team. All right. So the last question that I'll take from the team comes from Jonathan Roman. Jonathan Roman is one of our diversity champions within the DoD right now. And so his question is, how has MGM integrated diversity and inclusion into your hiring practices to increase in size or quality of your talent pool? And this goes back to a couple of our conversations on diversity as well as talent. And so how in MGM's role, and then, what of your new parent company, how are you guys factoring in diversity and inclusion in hiring practices?
Yeah. So again, I'll try not to speak too much on behalf of MGM or Amazon in order to not get something completely wrong. But I will say, particularly in the case of Amazon, they've doubled and tripled down on using data to get as wide a net as possible when they're looking for candidates. And then in some cases, setting hard marks in terms of hiring when it comes to candidates that are coming on board. And in other cases, setting hard marks for the amount of candidates from diverse backgrounds that need to come in for a particular role to be considered. Now, personally, I think where it really starts is not just lip service education to your leaders, but deep education into the ability to draw those hard lines yourself. So me personally, I've never had a problem with saying that the next person I'm going to hire is not going to be of this. They're not going to look like John Visneski. They're going to have to look like someone else because I know that person is out there. And that's not to say that I'm saying I'm going to throw away candidates that are super talented just because they're as handsome as I am. But I am saying that that is because I've had the opportunity to work with some great DEI leaders in the past, and they've drilled into me that it really has to start with leadership buying into those programs and divesting themselves from some of their own personal biases in terms of this is going to mean that we're getting rid of talented candidates in lieu of their demographic, when in reality it's understanding that the pool is super huge and you really need to double and triple down on where you're actually looking for those candidates. And so a lot of what the companies I've worked at have done is lean heavily into job fairs that are focused on particular demographics, going to geographic locations or city locations that have large pools of whatever demographic that you're trying to sort of reach out to, taking the time to personally go to those particular activities and really lean out there to try to find those candidates. They're there. But I think that things like LinkedIn and just email and just how we do job interview stuff in general, I think that has really made us a bit lazy when it comes to, broadening our net, when it comes to hiring new talent. And it's hard work, but that's exactly what leaders are there for, right? Like my job first and foremost is not to secure MGM or Amazon. My job first and foremost is to take care of my team. And so growing my team in a way that is encouraging diversity of thought, that diversity of background, diversity of gender, diversity of all those things, is job number one. And until we do a good enough job of educating the rest of our leaders around that mindset, I think we're going to have a tough climb.
Yeah, that's really good. To be honest, it's one of the better articulations of that approach. And how do we actually go after and understand that diversity of talent is a force multiplier and not a force inhibitor. And so I really appreciate that breakdown. All right. So man, that was quick. We've churned through 52 minutes really fast. And so this is the part where I'm going to go a little crazy. I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of hand out some of your pearls of leadership wisdom before I do a couple final questions and then close this out. So over to you. What are some leadership nuggets you'd like to impart for those that are joining us right now and those that'll watch this in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing, and I kind of hit on it a little bit at the top of the hour, I think the biggest misconception is that there's a huge difference between leadership in the private sector and leadership in the military. And what I mean by that is just because the military has more outwardly focused, rank structure, I salute this person, I do that, I do this. At the end of the day, humans are humans, workers are workers, technologists are technologists. And what we really want is to go to work for a boss that cares about us, work for a wage that we earn, be fulfilled in our job, and go home, and whether you have a family, whether you don't have a family, live a fulfilled and balanced personal life. And I think one of the things that struck me when I left the military was that folks in the private sector are thirsty for the leadership. They're thirsty for people that are not thinking about the profit margin at when they wake up in the morning, and not thinking about how am I going to push myself forward into some particular role, but really thinking about how am I as a leader going to empower the smart folks on my team to achieve the goals that they have. I sit down with every member of every team that I've coached, military or not, and the first conversation we have is, what do you want to be when you grow up? I haven't figured that out myself, but really, like, what do you want to be? Do you want my job? Because that's great. We'll get you on that glide slope. You want to be a principal engineer? That's great. We'll get you on that. Do you want to go be a plumber? We'll go figure that out. Do you want to work at this company or a different company, or all those sorts of things? Investing time in your people is something that transcends the industry that you work in. It transcends whether you're working at Pokemon, whether you're working in the Air Force, whether you're working at Amazon. And so keeping that in mind, I think is super key, particularly for the inflection point that the Air Force has been in for quite some time when it comes to, am I a technical leader? Am I a hands-on keyboard person? Am I fixing switches and routers, yada, yada, yada. Abstract all of that out of your mind and think about how you're taking care of the people that are around you, and you're always going to be successful.
Yeah, that's really good. And I appreciate that. So couple last things. If people want to reach out to you or follow you, where can they find you? Where can they connect to you?
I am, I think, the first John Visneski that shows up on LinkedIn. So by all means, that's probably the easiest way to get to me. More than happy to share my my email address on there and all those sorts of things, and we can take it from there. But my door is always open.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I appreciate your flexibility and willingness to come on and be guest number 5 technically, but session number 4, because we had a husband and wife team in number 2. And as I take a lot of notes during these, because I'm trying to learn the entire time. I have a lot of stuff to take into my current role, but we talked a lot about the differences or actual lack of difference there is between learning in the leading in the commercial sector and leading in the military. You talked about the desire of understanding the leadership. One of your final points is leadership transcends leadership in terms of taking care of your people transcends your organization. That's really the key, because it's the personal networking is really where you can get a lot of things done. You leverage that heavily in many of your roles, and you still stay connected. Understanding your people and being there for them is always good, because you can get more value out of them, and when you articulate the value that you have in them. You talked about the different challenges of cybersecurity and being, whether you're a technical cybersecurity professional, a business cybersecurity professional, or maybe one of those rare unicorns, as you said, that can do both. The importance of really telling a story, which you articulated, started in the combat comm world, which I completely endorse that perspective, and how being able to articulate the challenge and understand the risk and have that conversation, so that you're not that that leader that gets kept out of the room because you're going to scare the leadership. So, I mean, this has been tremendous, John. I really appreciate the time. It's been awesome to watch, having crossed your paths multiple times in the E-ring inside the glass doors and getting a peek behind the curtain and working things, and then to watch you grow and change through your profession. It's been pretty awesome. And I appreciate you taking the time to share your leadership with us in Lagniappe Leadership Discussion. As I stated, it means a little something extra, and you definitely brought a lot of something extra to this conversation. I appreciate everybody tuning in. In December, we have, we're going to have a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient as our member in our leadership discussion. And so I hope you all will join me in December, and I'll publish this. But John, thanks so much for your time, and I wish you all the best. And as I like to say, lead from the front, and you truly do that in your current role. So I appreciate you taking the time with us, and have a great evening, or late afternoon, I should say, out in Los Angeles.
Thanks, Gumbo. Hope to see you soon. Take care.
All right, thanks.